Now let's take a look at the culture of neurochemicals and the chemistry that we play with. If we think about just our daily life, we already are starting to associate, for instance, serotonin with depression, endorphins with sexual pleasure. And it's nothing new that people have used all kinds of different chemicals, herbs, to alter their mental states throughout history. There's always been wonder drugs as well that could cure everything. And I will just focus on two that today are illegal, but at the time they were considered to be the drug of the moment. Those are cocaine and LSD. And the person that we look at with cocaine is Freud. So how did it happen that Sigmund Freud ended up a cocaine addict? Well, in the early 1880s, pharmaceutical houses touted it as a cure from everything from morphine addiction to depression to fatigue. It was widely available in tonics, powders, wines, soft drinks, before its mass consumption created a cadre of raging addicts demanding medical attention. Initially, Sigmund Freud was eager to employ cocaine as an antidote for his best friend's morphine addiction. His friend Ernest Frischl Marxow was a brilliant physiologist who injured his thumb while dissecting a cadaver, resulting in chronic pain tamed only by large doses of morphine. Freud's most haunting encounter with the drug occurred in 1895, after he and a colleague named Wilhelm Fleiss nearly killed a patient named Emma Eckstein with a botched operation and too much cocaine. Several nights later, he had a disturbing dream about a party where she blamed Freud for his gross negligence. Today, Eckstein is known as Irma, the pseudonym Freud gave her in his masterpiece, The Interpretation of Dreams. When writing about his dream, Freud glossed over his obvious malpractice, an act that today would have resulted in a disgrace, loss of medical license, lawsuits, and even jail. Instead, he explained the dream meant that he was a caring doctor who was, if anything, overly concerned about his patient, Irma. There are many more stories about Freud and his addiction that you can find online. And it's interesting to think of some of his ideas and how they were influenced by his being in that state of cocaine addiction. Now we turn to another drug that initially was completely open and legal to experiment with, LSD. LSD was first synthesized by the Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann in the Sandoz laboratories in 1938. The hallucinogenic effects of LSD were unknown for the next 5 years. Dr. Hofmann writes, "My problem child that a peculiar presentiment prompted him to revisit LSD-25. While resynthesizing the compound for further study, he became dizzy and was forced to stop work." He writes, "Last Friday, April 16, 1943, I was forced to interrupt my work in the laboratory in the middle of the afternoon and proceed home, being affected by a remarkable restlessness combined with a slight dizziness. At home, I lay down and sank into a not unpleasant, intoxicated-like condition, characterized by an extremely stimulated imagination. In a dreamlike state, with eyes closed, I perceived an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes with intense kaleidoscopic play of colors. After some 2 hours, this condition faded away. 3 days later, April 19th, Dr. Hofmann intentionally ingested 250 micrograms of LSD. Now note that 25 is what would be considered enough, which he hypothesized would be the threshold dose. By now, it was already clear to me, he writes, that LSD had been the cause of the remarkable experience of the previous Friday, for the altered perceptions were the same type as before, only much more intense. I had to struggle to speak intelligibly. I asked my laboratory assistant, who was informed of the self-experiment, to escort me home. We went by bicycle, no automobile being available because of wartime restrictions on their use. On the way home, my condition began to assume threatening forms. Everything in my field of vision wavered and was distorted as if seen in a curved mirror. I also had the sensation of being unable to move from the spot. Nevertheless, my assistant later told me we had traveled very rapidly. Dr. Hoffman summoned a doctor who could find no abnormal physical symptoms other than extremely dilated pupils. After spending several hours terrified that his body had been possessed by a demon, that his next-door neighbor was a witch, and that his furniture was threatening him, Dr. Hoffman feared he had become completely insane. The doctor saw no reason to prescribe any medication. Instead, he conveyed me to my bed and stood and watched over me. Slowly, I came back from a weird, unfamiliar world to reassuring everyday reality. The horror softened and gave way to a feeling of good fortune and gratitude. The more normal perception and thoughts returned, and I became more confident that the danger of insanity was conclusively past. Now, little by little, I could begin to enjoy the unprecedented colors and plays of shapes that persisted behind my closed eyes. Kaleidoscopic, fantastic images surged on me, alternating, opening and closing themselves in circles, spirals, exploding in colored fountains, rearranging and hybridizing themselves in constant flux. It was particularly remarkable how every acoustic perception, such as sound of the door handle or passing automobile, became transformed into optical perceptions. Every sound generated a vividly changing image with its own consistent form and color. And so it continues, the interest in the drug after Dr. Hoffman's experiment on himself. LSD was introduced into the United States in 1948, and Sandoz Laboratories marketed LSD as a psychiatric cure-all and hailed it as a remedy for everything from schizophrenia to criminal behavior, sexual perversions, and alcoholism. In psychiatry, the use of LSD by students was an accepted practice. It was viewed as a teaching tool in an attempt to enable the psychiatrist to subjectively understand schizophrenia. It was also shown as a great promise for facilitating psychedelic psychotherapy. In one study, in the late 50s, Dr. Humphrey Osmond gave LSD to alcoholics in Alcoholics Anonymous who had failed to stop drinking. After 1 year, around 50% of the study group had not had a drink, a success rate that has never been duplicated by any other means. Now we move into another personality who left a thumbprint in relation to creativity and the early history of LSD, renowned British author and playwright Aldous Huxley. He was a figure of high repute in the world of letters and became very famous with his novels, Chrome Yellow, Antic Hay, and of course the dystopian novel Brave New World. His experiments with psychedelic drugs and his descriptions of them in his writings did much to spread awareness of this drug to the general public and arguably helped glamorize their recreational use. Although Huxley himself was very serious about the use. Huxley was introduced to psychedelic drugs by a friend, psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond. In May 1953, Osmond gave Huxley his first dose of mescaline. Huxley subsequently recorded his experiences in the landmark book, The Doors of Perception. The title of this book was from a quote by a British artist and poet, William Blake. And Huxley book, in turn, was the source of the name of the American rock band, The Doors. Huxley tried LSD the first time in 1955, obtained from Captain Al Hubbard. Hubbard is a remarkable and controversial figure in his own right and is almost equally important in the history of LSD as Huxley and Timothy O'Leary. He became a freelance apostle for LSD in the early 50s after supposedly receiving an angelic vision telling him that something important to the future of mankind would soon be coming. When he read about LSD the next year, he immediately sought and acquired it and tried it himself in 1951. Timothy Leary is another controversial person that contributed to the counterculture in the 60s with LSD. He was a psychology professor at Harvard University and the most pro-LSD researcher for the rest of his life, in fact. He began conducting experiments with psilocybin in 1960 on himself and, believe it or not, a number of graduate students at Harvard after trying hallucinogenic mushrooms used in Native American religious rituals while visiting Mexico. His group began conducting experiments on state prisoners where they claimed a 90% success rate for preventing repeat offenses. A student introduced Leary to LSD, and then he incorporated that drug into his research as his mental catalyst of choice. His experiments produced no murders, suicides, psychotic breaks, or bad trips. Almost all of his participants reported profound mystical experiences, which they felt had a tremendous positive effect on their lives. But by 1962, faculty discontent with Leary's experiment reached critical mass, and Leary was informed that the CIA was monitoring his research. Many of the other faculty members had harbored reservations about his research, and powerful parents began complaining to the university about his distribution of hallucinogenic drugs to their children. Additionally, many undergraduate students who were not part of Leary's research program heard of the profound experience other students had undergone and began taking LSD, which was not illegal at the time, recreationally. Leary described LSD as a potent aphrodisiac in an interview with Playboy magazine, and another professor, Richard Alpert, together with Leary, was dismissed from the university in 1963. He coined the slogan, "Turn on, tune in, and dropped out." Leary later wrote, "We saw ourselves as anthropologists from the 21st century, inhabiting a time module set somewhere in the dark ages of the 1960s. On this space colony, we were attempting to create a new paganism and a new dedication to life as art." But Leary's work was not that popular with a judge who expressed dislike for his books and sentenced him to 30 years in prison for possession of half a marijuana cigarette, which was later reversed by the Supreme Court. Around this time also, President Richard Nixon described Leary as the most dangerous man in America. LSD was also part of government experiments. The CIA top secret MK Ultra project was an ambitious undertaking from the 50s through the 70s designed to explore the possibilities of pharmaceutical mind control. Hundreds of participants, including CIA agents, government employees, military personnel, prostitutes, members of the general public, and mental patients were given LSD, many without their knowledge or consent. The experiments often involved severe psychological torture, and many victims committed suicide or wound up in psychiatric wards. The researchers eventually concluded that LSD's effects were too varied and uncontrollable to make it of any practical use as a truth drug, and the project moved to other substances. It would be decades before the US government admitted the existence of the project and offered apologies to the families of those who died during the experiments.